Welcome to Public Interest Before Corporate Interest YouTube presentation. We're in the shade. It's 40 plus outside, so obviously it'd be a bit silly to be out in the midday sun, as they say. You can hear the birds. They don't care about the sun, but they should, because it's going to get warmer and warmer. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I want to discuss public interest before corporate interests, not the concept, which is a very simple concept of putting the interests of the many before the interests of the few, but in terms of the organisation which I'm the registered officer for, which is public interest before corporate interests. Now, public interest before corporate interest was set up in early 2015 for the important work that needs to be done to ensure that people begin to understand what public is. During the last 4 decades, during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution, we have seen a huge change in the language, And when we first set up the organisation in 2015, most people we spoke to, and these were intelligent people, they may not be overtly political people, but intelligent people, they didn't even know what the concept public meant. To them, public meant something which was second rate, wasn't as good as the private sector. So what we've seen over the last 4 decades is the denigration of the concept that the interests of the many should be put before the interests of the few. And during this privatisation era, we've seen the growth of inequality, both in terms of the exercise of power and in terms of wealth. Now, an average wage doesn't really explain what's happening in Australia today. And public interest before corporate interest was set up in order to provide a different drumbeat, a different way of looking at the world. Not a new way, but a different way. It's an old way. It's a new way. It's about putting the interest of the many before the few. And part of our program was to establish a political party, a federal political party that could be involved in parliamentary elections in Australia. Now, a lot of people obviously are jaded with parliamentary elections and they wonder why we're wasting our time with parliamentary elections. Unfortunately, in Australia, there's not going to be any revolution. And even if there is, as we've seen with the growth of minor parties which are following an authoritarian line, it'll be more of the same. So if you think there's going to be a revolution tomorrow, you're dreaming, as they said in the castle, you're dreaming. So obviously what we need to look at is all legal available options we have to promote these ideas, and obviously protests, petitions, direct action, boycotts, strikes, the list goes on, is part and parcel of the legal options we follow in order to bring about change. But fundamentally, change in Australia is determined by parliamentary politics. Whether you like it or not, change is determined by parliamentary politics. And what we have in Australia in 2021 is a system of government where those who exercise power and hold wealth set the parliamentary agenda. We've seen this simply with Google's kickback and Facebook's kickback as far as passing legislation for them to pay a little bit of extra money. So you can see that every day you have large corporations which dominate the parliamentary agenda. It's no accident with the New Year's with the Invasion Day honours list behind us, that particularly noxious ceremony, that 130 of the 250 CEOs of Australia's major corporations have won high honours of Orders of Australia. It's no accident, because these are the people who determine the parliamentary agenda, and that agenda is determined by their push to create profits for their major shareholders and company owners, irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. That's what it's about. So it's important that we have a political organisation which can actually use the parliamentary elections and use the parliamentary process in order to widen the debate. Widen the debate. And that's what PIBCI was about. It wasn't about us forming a political organisation thinking somehow we were going to break the major political parties, that somehow our members would be elected to Parliament, although it's a possibility. As they say in Tats Lotto, if you haven't got a ticket, you can't win it. But the reality is, our push into parliamentary elections is similar to somebody buying a ticket for Tats Lotto. Very few win. But what we are able to do by standing candidates in federal elections, both for the House of Representatives and the Senate, is raise new ideas, ideas which are not based on division and hate and differences. Because over the last 40 years, it's these parties are the parties that have been able to gain the political ascendancy in this country. Those which promote division and hatred and inequality. Because the parliamentary agenda is the same, year after year after year, and it's set once again by those people who control wealth and power in this country. That small section that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And if you think I'm making this up, think about it. 25 million people living on a continent, a resource-rich continent, almost 1 million children living in poverty. 1/3 of the population living on social security benefits. 80% of the population been involved in some type of paid employment in order to pay off debts, ever increasing debts because of the transformation of the housing market into an investment market. And everywhere we look, it's about investments. Now, you may be involved in an issue-orientated campaign, and I'm involved in many issue-orientated campaigns personally, but that's not the role of public interest before corporate interest. Our role is to examine the nature of society we have and provide alternatives to what we have today. Because of all the people living on this planet, we should have been able to tackle the issues that forever bedevil us. And it's no accident in a society that's highly privatised and individualised that we have the second highest rate of anxiety and psychiatric disorders in this country. And that over 20% of the population at any one time, and that includes children, will be on some type of medication, to deal with this anxiety. It's no accident that we're told it's our issue, it's our personal issue. But the reality is, the type of society you live in and how you feel and how you react are interlinked. And if you live in a highly competitive society where you need to pay your bills and you're under constant pressure and you've got no representation in Parliament, you've got no representation in organisations which look after your interests, then it's no accident that we have this situation. Now, as I'm talking, you'll see that I'll be doing the Great Australian Salute as I brush off a fly or two, because obviously flies love the heat. But that's not... See, there are a lot of flies in our society. A lot of flies. And most of them are in positions of authority. And if you want to squat a fly, sometimes you have to be a little bit adventurous and use your brain. And for us moving into the parliamentary election field as a political party, as a registered political party, means that we may have some impact on driving the debate in our society in a direction where we are able to overcome the problems caused by privatisation and globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation. Because they don't care how many times you protest in the street. They don't care how many times you take limited industrial action under laws in Australia which have made strikes illegal in this country. They don't care if you take to alcohol or drugs because you're so depressed about the situation. They don't care if you're medicated out of your mind. They don't care if you vote for the same political parties every time there is a federal election. But they do care if we move in on their territory. They do care if we move into their tent, stop throwing rocks at their tents which are bounced back at us, and we move into their tent and we start cutting up that tent. They care about that. They care about people taking a different pathways and talking about a different pathway and talking about why we have increasing inequalities in this country, talking about why our resources are owned by transnational corporations and all we get, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, is a peppercorn royalties and a little bit of taxation. They do care when we start talking about that 1/3 of corporations legally paid no tax last year. They do care when people like Solomon Lew and Harvey Norman are pilloried because they're keeping all this JobKeeper money which they were given, a lot of the JobKeeper, and then they do it legally. Nothing illegal about it. So we have a legal system when they talk about the rule of law. They say democracy is based on the rule of law. Democracy isn't based on the rule of law. You can be in a totalitarian regime and have a rule of law where Jews are exterminated. You can be in a totalitarian regime where you have rule of law where blonde, blue-eyed 2-year-olds are the devil's spawn and they need to be exterminated. Democracy is not about the rule of law. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. And that's the key. It's not just rule of the people, by the people, it's for the people, for the many, for the public. And that's why public interest before corporate interest was established. To give people the opportunity to move, to incorporate a wider framework in their political action, in their social actions, in their cultural action. Because the personal and political are intertwined, whether we like it or not. And the dilemma today is we just have the personal and we have the political. We don't have any intermingling. So public interest before corporate interests is hard going. Currently we have 425 members on the Commonwealth electoral roll and we need 550 before we can apply for registration as a federal political party. Because there are rules. That's right. There are rules in a parliamentary democracy about who can stand for election, what is a registered political party. And currently the rules mean that you need 550 people on the Commonwealth electoral roll. And our major concern as we come to the end of January and the beginning of February 2021, our major concern is that we will not have the 550 members by the end of June this year, because a federal election will be held later on this year or early in 2022. And it can take up to 6 months for a federal political party to be registered, because obviously there'll be a lot of, jumps, a lot of hoops, roundabouts that we will have to negotiate in order to register public interest before corporate interest, because it is a threat to the status quo, because it raises the very important question of putting the public, the many, before the interests of the public, the many before the interests of the few. So if you are depressed by the current situation, I'm asking you not to be depressed, because that's what they want. They want us to think that resistance is useless. They want us to internalise this anxiety, the inequalities. They want us to internalise it and think it's our problem. And somehow, if we read the right books and do the right things and follow the right gurus, we will somehow resolve issues which are beyond us. They're quite happy when you go there and protest, because they can say, look at that, we live in a free society, we allow them to protest. Obviously, if your protests become significant, then as we've seen during the COVID-19 epidemic, the state has at its disposals mechanisms via which it can curtail any so-called liberties you think you have. irrespective of whether it's a health pandemic or a political pandemic, because people... So, if you have no faith in the system, if you are concerned about the current situation, if you're concerned about the direction the major political parties have been taking over the last few decades, if you're concerned about the tweedledum electoral system we have, if you're concerned about a climate emergency, the fact there is no treaty, the fact that there is no universal basic income, the fact that we have one of the highest rates of psychiatric disorders and psychological disorders in the world, the fact that there are 25 million of us living on a resource-rich continent and we can't enjoy the bounty from those resources, the fact that your children will have as little chance of improving their lives as we go on because the elevator, the social elevator which allowed people to climb on each other's backs and somehow improve themselves, has been shut down. The fact that if you're concerned about your superannuation and where that's going, and that's the key for a lot of older people, they're hostages to their superannuation, thinking that somehow that is what's going to give them liberty in old age and allow them to do what they like. Superannuation is nothing more than the privatisation of old age, of the state absolving its responsibilities of looking after its citizens. So if you're concerned about all these things, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests, and I encourage you to do it now. It's interesting how many phone calls I have, emails I answer, application forms I send out, and how few come back. How few come back. This is an emergency. We don't just have a climate emergency, we have a political emergency and a social emergency and a cultural emergency. Not because of COVID-19. COVID-19 is just a new imposition, but because of this type of society we have allowed to be created. We believe the fact that everybody can win Tats Lotto. Well, not everybody wins Tats Lotto. Not everybody wins Tats Lotto. You know that. Those of you who've taken out a ticket in your lives, very few people win Tats Lotto because it's structured in such a way. And it's the same with our society. Our society is structured in such a way as to ensure that those who have power and wealth continue to accumulate power and wealth and manipulate the parliamentary system in order to ensure that their agenda is always put before the agenda of every other section of the Australian people. Joining is easy. You can download the application form from PIBCI, PIBCI.net, and send it back. If you're not computer literate, if you don't like computers, you want an application form, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489. Hate phones? Sorry. You can always write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. The ball's in your court. We've done what we can over the last few years. Unless we get those 550 members, we won't be able to pursue this avenue. That doesn't mean we're not going to continue to pursue other avenues that I spoke about before: community boycotts, strikes, protest, petitions, every legal avenue. But when you're involved in the struggle for major, radical, egalitarian, political, social and cultural change, we need to be able to harness every legal option we have at our disposal. And parliamentary elections are one of the options via which we can extend the debate currently in this country, a debate which is pathetically naive, a debate which is manipulated by celebrities, a debate which is controlled by the hate mongers on social media. We need to move away from that and become involved in an organisation that is willing and wants to make major changes to ensure that the resources that we hold in common, that's the Commonwealth of Australia, are used in common. Next week, who knows what we'll be talking about, but hopefully it won't be so hot.